The spring of 1884 arrived slowly in the Colorado Territory. Winter refused to loosen its grip on the mountains. Snow still rested beneath the towering pines, while icy streams carried melting water into the valleys below. Yet beneath the cold earth, life was beginning again. Green shoots pushed through the frozen ground, birds returned to their nests, and ranchers prepared for another season of hard work. Just outside the growing town of Silver Creek stood the Walker Ranch. People often said there wasn't a stronger ranch within 50 miles. Its fences stretched farther than most men could ride before breakfast. Hundreds of cattle grazed across rolling grasslands. Large red barns stood proudly beside weathered corrals, while smoke curled gently from the chimney of the ranch house every morning. Everything about the ranch spoke of one man, Samuel Walker. For nearly 40 years, Samuel had built the ranch with his own hands. He had arrived in the valley with nothing more than a wagon, 2 horses, and an axe. Through endless days of labor, bitter winters, droughts, cattle disease, and more than a few close calls with outlaws, he transformed empty wilderness into one of the finest ranches in the territory. But Samuel Walker was gone. The church bell rang slowly across Silver Creek. Every resident knew what the sound meant. The man who had quietly helped widows repair roofs, loaned cattle to struggling neighbors, and never turned away a hungry traveler had been laid to rest 3 days earlier. Many still struggled to believe he was gone. Early that morning, 2 riders approached the town lawyer's office from opposite directions. The first was Thomas Walker. His black coat was made from expensive wool imported from Denver. His polished boots gleamed despite the muddy roads. His silver pocket watch swung from a fine chain across his vest. Thomas had always cared about appearances. He believed success should be seen before it was spoken. As he tied his horse outside the office, he adjusted his collar and glanced at his reflection in the window. He smiled. Today, he believed, was the day his future truly began. Several minutes later came the second rider, Elias Walker. Unlike his older brother, Elias wore a faded brown work coat, patched several times over the years. His hat had lost much of its shape after countless days beneath rain and summer sun. His boots carried dust from the ranch. His hands were rough, with calluses earned honestly. Beside his horse trotted an aging golden shepherd mix. The dog's muzzle had turned gray. One ear no longer stood upright. His movements were slower than they once had been, but his eyes remained sharp. Everyone in Silver Creek knew the old dog. His name was Scout. Children often laughed that Scout knew the ranch better than any hired hand. Older ranchers simply nodded. He probably does. Scout had spent nearly 12 years beside Samuel Walker. He had herded cattle, warned of wolves, found lost calves, even saved Samuel's life once after a horse threw him into a ravine. Samuel never went anywhere without Scout. Now, Scout refused to leave Elias's side. As Elias climbed the steps toward the lawyer's office, Scout followed close behind. The lawyer looked down at the faithful dog. "I suppose he's family too." Elias smiled softly. "He always has been." Inside the office, everything smelled of old books, leather, and ink. Heavy curtains softened the morning light. Shelves lined every wall, filled with thick law books, whose pages had yellowed with age. A large grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Each swing of its pendulum sounded louder than the last. Thomas sat confidently in the finest chair. Elias quietly took the seat opposite him. Scout lay on the wooden floor between them. No one spoke. The silence carried years of unspoken history. Although they shared the same father, the brothers had grown into very different men. Thomas had always chased opportunity wherever it promised comfort. As a young man, he spent more time in town than on horseback. He enjoyed card games, fancy clothes, and conversations with businessmen who dreamed of quick fortunes. Samuel often warned him, "A ranch isn't built in a day, son." Thomas would laugh. "Neither is wealth." Elias was different. Long before sunrise each morning, he saddled horses, repaired fences, chopped firewood, and rode the range beside his father. Samuel rarely needed to ask. Elias simply saw what needed doing and did it. Neighbors often joked that the ranch had two owners, Samuel and Elias, yet Samuel always corrected them. "No, I have two sons." The office door opened once more. Mr. Benjamin Carter, the town lawyer, entered carrying several leather folders. He removed his spectacles and looked sadly at both brothers. "Your father was one of the finest men I've ever known." Neither brother answered. The lawyer carefully unfolded a handwritten document. "I'll now read the last will and testament of Samuel Walker." Scout lifted his head, almost as if he understood. The lawyer began, "I, Samuel Walker, being of sound mind." His calm voice filled the room. He first thanked friends, neighbors, and ranch hands who had helped build the ranch over many years. Then came several small gifts, a silver pocket watch to the church pastor, 2 horses to longtime foreman Caleb Morris, money to the town school. Finally, the lawyer reached the final page. His voice slowed. "I leave the Walker Ranch." Thomas leaned forward. "Including all cattle, grazing rights, barns, equipment, livestock, and surrounding property." A smile slowly appeared on Thomas's face. "To my eldest son." Thomas folded his hands confidently. "Thomas Walker." Silence. The lawyer continued. "My younger son, Elias Walker." Elias waited. "Shall receive my horse, my saddle, my Winchester rifle, and my faithful companion Scout." Nothing else followed. The room became perfectly still. Even the grandfather clock seemed louder. Tick, tick, tick. Elias stared at the lawyer. "I'm sorry. There must be another page." Mr. Carter slowly shook his head. "No, that's the complete document." Thomas let out a slow breath of satisfaction. "I suppose father knew exactly what he was doing." Elias looked at him in disbelief. "I worked that ranch beside him every day." Thomas shrugged. "And yet here we are. I buried calves in snowstorms beside him." No answer. "I rebuilt the north fence after the flood." Still nothing. "I sat beside his bed every night during his illness." Thomas stood. "But I inherited the ranch." The lawyer cleared his throat. "If I may." Both brothers looked toward him. "Your father never explained his reasoning." "I can only read what he wrote." Elias lowered his eyes. For the first time since Samuel's death, his heart truly broke. Not because he wanted riches, not because he wanted ownership, but because he suddenly wondered whether his father had somehow believed all those years of quiet labor meant nothing. Scout slowly stood. Without making a sound, the old dog rested his head against Elias's knee. Elias gently stroked the gray fur. "You always knew how to comfort him." He whispered the words so quietly that no one else heard them. Outside the office, nearly a dozen ranch hands had gathered. Word spread quickly in small towns. Everyone knew the will had just been read. Caleb Morris stepped forward as the brothers emerged. "What happened?" Thomas answered, before Elias could speak. "The ranch is mine." Several men smiled politely. Then Thomas added, "And Elias no longer works there." The smiles disappeared. Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." Thomas folded the will into his coat. "He has until sunset to leave." The older ranch hand looked shocked. "Sir, he's lived there his whole life." "So?" "He helped your father build every inch of it." Thomas's expression hardened. "And now, I own every inch of it." One young ranch hand muttered, "That doesn't seem right." Thomas turned sharply. "Anyone who disagrees is welcome to leave with him." No one answered. Not because they agreed, because they needed their jobs. That afternoon, Elias quietly packed his belongings. There wasn't much. A few changes of clothes. A worn family Bible with his mother's name written inside. His father's old rifle. A cast-iron skillet blackened from years over campfires. 2 blankets. A small wooden box filled with family photographs. One by one, he placed them into an old wagon. Every item carried memories. Every corner of the ranch reminded him of another season spent beside his father. There was the fence where Samuel had taught him to mend broken rails, the creek where they caught fish together, the oak tree beneath which his mother used to read scripture aloud before she passed away, the blacksmith shed where father and son often worked until long after sunset. Every step across the property felt like saying goodbye to a lifetime. Several ranch hands approached quietly. Caleb removed his hat. "I'm sorry, son." Elias forced a small smile. "It isn't your fault." One by one, the men shook his hand. Some could not speak. Others wiped away tears. Even the toughest cowboys in the territory knew an injustice when they saw one. As the sun sank behind the mountains, Elias climbed into the wagon. Without anyone calling him, Scout leaped into the back beside the supplies. Thomas watched from the porch. "You can keep the dog." Elias looked at Scout. "I wasn't planning to leave him." Scout settled beside the old rifle, then turned his eyes toward the weathered red barn. He stared at it for several long moments. His ears lifted. His nose twitched. It was as though he remembered something buried deep within his faithful heart. Then, with one final glance, he faced forward. Elias flicked the reins gently. The wagon rolled down the long dirt road, leaving behind the only home he had ever known. The ranch disappeared slowly behind the hills. Neither Elias nor Thomas noticed that the old dog looked back until the buildings vanished from sight. Far behind them, the evening wind whispered through the empty pasture. And beneath the oldest barn on the Walker Ranch, a secret waited patiently. A secret only one faithful dog still remembered. The first morning after leaving the Walker Ranch was colder than Elias expected. A thick blanket of fog rested over the valley, hiding the distant mountains. The air smelled of wet pine and melting snow. Every breath drifted before him in white clouds as he guided his old horse along a narrow trail leading deeper into the wilderness. Behind him, Scout rode quietly in the wagon, his graying muzzle resting on the edge of a wooden crate. He had barely moved since they left the ranch. Every now and then, he lifted his head and looked back toward the valley, as though expecting someone to call them home. No one did. By noon, Elias reached an abandoned trapper's cabin tucked beside a small creek. It had likely stood empty for years. Moss covered much of the roof, one window was broken, and the front porch leaned badly to one side. It wasn't much, but it was dry. For now, it would have to do. Elias climbed down from the wagon and looked around. "Well, Scout," he said with a tired smile, "it's not the Walker Ranch." Scout wagged his tail anyway. The old dog had never cared where he slept. As long as he was beside his master, he seemed content. The first week tested every bit of Elias's strength. The roof leaked whenever snow melted in the afternoon. Cold winds slipped through cracks in the cabin walls each night. The fireplace barely held enough heat to warm one room. Food became a daily concern. Elias refused to complain. Instead, he worked. Each sunrise began before daylight. He repaired broken boards using fallen timber from the nearby forest. He patched holes in the roof with cedar shingles he cut himself. He cleared brush around the cabin to reduce the danger of fire. He dug a small vegetable garden, though he knew it would be weeks before anything grew. Every afternoon he checked rabbit snares, fished in the creek, or hunted deer farther into the mountains. The work reminded him of something his father often said. Hard seasons don't last forever. Honest work usually does. Those words stayed with Elias every day. Scout helped whenever he could. Though old, the faithful dog still possessed sharp instincts. More than once he barked just before a deer appeared through the trees. One afternoon he chased a hungry coyote away from the cabin. Another evening, he woke Elias moments before a fallen tree crashed onto the old shed beside the cabin. Elias scratched behind Scout's ears. "You've earned your supper again." Scout's tail thumped happily against the floor. Yet despite their growing routine, something about the old dog had changed. Every evening, after supper, Scout walked outside alone. He climbed a small hill overlooking the valley. There he simply stood, watching toward the distant Walker Ranch. Sometimes he remained there for nearly an hour before quietly returning to the cabin. Elias noticed but thought little of it. Perhaps the old dog missed home. Truthfully, so did he. Nearly 2 weeks passed. Then something unusual happened. One morning Elias awoke before sunrise. Scout was gone. His blanket near the fireplace sat empty. The cabin door hung slightly open. Elias stepped outside. Fresh paw prints led away into the forest. Scout? Only silence answered. He searched around the creek. No sign. He checked nearby hills. Nothing. Hours passed. By afternoon, worry settled heavily upon him. The old dog was nearly 12 years old. The mountains held wolves, bears, and steep cliffs. Elias feared the worst. As the sun began dropping behind the western peaks, a familiar bark echoed through the trees. Scout emerged from the woods. Covered in dust, his paws were muddy. Small twigs clung to his fur. He looked exhausted, but otherwise unharmed. Elias hurried over and knelt beside him. "Where have you been?" Scout licked his hand, then drank nearly an entire bucket of water before curling beside the fireplace and falling asleep almost immediately. Elias laughed quietly. "You've certainly been somewhere." The following morning, Scout disappeared again. This time, Elias noticed him leave. The old dog slipped quietly through the trees just after sunrise. He didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He walked with surprising purpose, almost like a man following directions he already knew. Again he returned near sunset, again covered in dust, again too tired to do much besides eat and sleep. By the 4th day, Elias became curious. By the 6th day, he became puzzled. By the 10th, he knew something was happening. Scout wasn't wandering. He was traveling somewhere specific. One chilly morning, Elias made a decision. "If you're keeping a secret," he told Scout while pouring coffee over the fire, "today, I'm finding out." Scout tilted his head, as though he understood every word. Elias smiled. "I'll follow from a distance." After sunrise, Scout quietly left the cabin once again. This time, Elias waited several minutes before saddling his horse. Keeping well back, he followed the old dog through the forest. The journey surprised him. Scout traveled farther than Elias expected. He crossed shallow streams without hesitation. He squeezed between rocky cliffs where only someone familiar with the mountains would know the safest path. He climbed ridges, descended narrow trails, and passed through thick pine forests. Nearly 4 hours later, the trees finally opened. Elias stopped his horse behind a cluster of aspens. His breath caught. Below him lay the Walker Ranch. Scout had walked all the way back home. Elias watched carefully. The dog never approached the ranch house. He ignored the corrals, ignored the windmill, ignored the main barn. Instead, he trotted toward the oldest building on the property. A weathered red barn Samuel Walker himself had built nearly 30 years earlier. The structure had always fascinated children. Its heavy beams were thicker than most tree trunks. Its stone foundation rested deep in the earth. Samuel had once joked that the barn would outlive everyone who lived on the ranch. Scout disappeared behind it. Curious, Elias tied his horse among the trees and quietly crept closer. Peering around the corner, he froze. Scout stood beside a patch of bare ground. The old dog lowered his nose. He sniffed carefully, circled twice, then began scratching at the earth. Not wildly, not like a dog chasing a gopher. Slowly, patiently, almost deliberately. Elias frowned. "What are you doing, old friend?" Scout paused, looked toward Elias, then scratched again. The soil appeared different from the surrounding ground, slightly uneven, as though many years earlier someone had dug there before carefully covering it again. Elias stepped closer. His curiosity grew stronger with every second. He picked up a nearby stick and gently scraped away loose dirt. The earth beneath seemed firmer, compacted. Before he could dig farther, voices drifted from inside the barn. Scout immediately stopped scratching. His ears lifted. Elias ducked behind a stack of old hay bales just as three men entered the barn. The first voice belonged to Thomas. He sounded frustrated. "No, it has to be here somewhere." A second man spoke. His voice carried the smooth confidence of someone who made his living convincing others to trust him. "Your father was known for keeping records." Thomas paced angrily. "I've searched the house twice. The office. The cellar. The attic. Nothing." The third man chuckled. "Maybe the old man spent everything before he died." Thomas shook his head. "No. He always talked about a family secret. He said one day I'd understand." The second man leaned against a wooden post. "You never asked what he meant." Thomas looked embarrassed. "He started telling me once. I was in a hurry. I told him we'd talk another time." Silence filled the barn. Finally, Thomas muttered, "There wasn't another time." The three men spread out. One searched inside old grain bins. Another tapped the barn floor with the handle of his shovel. Thomas climbed into the loft, moving old crates that had not been touched in years. Elias remained hidden. His heart pounded. What were they looking for? More importantly, why did Scout lead him here? The old dog quietly walked back toward Elias without making a sound. He sat beside him, then looked directly toward the patch of disturbed earth behind the barn. His eyes never left it. Elias followed his gaze. Something about the old dog's expression unsettled him. Scout wasn't acting on instinct. He was remembering something from years ago. Suddenly, a memory returned to Elias. One summer evening, nearly 6 years earlier, he had watched his father working behind the old barn after sunset. Samuel had carried a lantern and a shovel. When Elias asked if he needed help, Samuel simply smiled. "No, son. I'm putting something away." "What is it?" "Something I'll need someone trustworthy to find." At the time, Elias had thought little of it. Now, those words echoed inside his mind. Someone trustworthy. He looked at Scout. The old dog slowly wagged his tail, as though he had been waiting all these years for Elias to remember. Thomas's voice suddenly interrupted the silence. "We're wasting time." The second man frowned. "If the papers exist, they're somewhere on this property." Thomas kicked an old wooden crate across the floor. "I don't care how long it takes. We'll tear this entire ranch apart if we have to." The three men mounted their horses and rode away toward the ranch house. Elias waited until the sound of hoofbeats disappeared. Only then did he stand. Scout immediately walked back to the patch of earth. He placed one paw gently on the ground, then looked up at Elias. There was no barking, no whining, just quiet certainty. Elias knelt beside the old dog. He rested a hand on Scout's gray head. "I don't know what father trusted you with." Scout blinked slowly. "But I think—" Elias looked once more at the disturbed ground. "I think you've been trying to show me." The evening breeze swept gently across the empty pasture. The setting sun painted the old red barn in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere beneath that quiet patch of earth, a secret had waited for years. And if Scout's faithful memory was right, the time had finally come for it to be uncovered. Chapter 3. Buried Beneath the Barn. Expanded script, approx 15 to 20 minutes. Night settled gently over the Colorado Territory. A silver moon climbed above the snow-covered peaks, casting long shadows across the Walker Ranch. The evening wind whispered through the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called into the darkness. The ranch looked peaceful. But Elias Walker's heart was anything but. He sat beside the small fire outside the trapper's cabin, staring into the dancing flames, while Scout rested quietly at his feet. Neither of them had slept much since returning from the ranch that afternoon. Again and again, Elias replayed what he had seen. Thomas, the two strangers, their desperate search, and most of all, the patch of earth behind the old barn. Finally, Elias looked down at Scout. "You've known all this time, haven't you?" The old dog slowly opened one eye. His tail thumped once against the ground. Elias smiled faintly. "You always did understand father better than most people." Scout stood. Without hesitation, he walked toward the wagon. He stopped beside Samuel's old shovel, which Elias had brought from the ranch years earlier after repairing fences. The dog looked at the shovel, then back at Elias. Elias laughed quietly. "All right. I suppose you're telling me we leave tonight." Scout wagged his tail. Less than an hour later, the old horse carried them silently through the forest beneath the moonlight. Elias avoided the main road. Instead, he followed narrow game trails his father had taught him many years before. Samuel used to say, "The quietest path is often the safest one." Those words echoed through Elias's mind as branches brushed gently against his shoulders. Every sound seemed louder at night. The creaking saddle, the horse's slow breathing, the distant rush of mountain streams. Even Scout's paws made almost no noise as he trotted ahead. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking the Walker Ranch, Elias stopped. Lanterns still burned inside the main house. Thomas was awake. The strangers' horses remained tied outside the porch. "They're still searching," Elias whispered. Scout looked toward the old barn, almost impatiently. Waiting until every lantern inside the ranch house finally went dark, Elias led the horse behind a stand of cottonwood trees. He tied the reins securely. Then he and Scout crossed the pasture on foot. Every step felt dangerous. The moon disappeared behind thick clouds. Darkness covered the ranch. Only the soft chirping of crickets broke the silence. The old red barn stood exactly as Elias remembered. Weathered, strong, unmoving. It had survived blizzards, floods, and countless seasons of hard work. Samuel had often called it the heart of the ranch. Scout walked confidently around the back. He never hesitated. He stopped at the same patch of earth, then sat down, waiting. Elias rested the shovel against the ground. He took one deep breath. "If this is Father's secret, I pray I'm worthy of finding it." With that, he drove the shovel into the earth. The soil was harder than he expected. Years of rain had packed it tightly. Each shovelful landed quietly beside the growing hole. Scout remained perfectly still, watching. Several minutes passed. Nothing. Only dirt, roots, small stones. Elias wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cool night air. Perhaps he had misunderstood. Perhaps Scout remembered the wrong place. Perhaps... Thunk. The shovel struck something solid. Elias froze. He knelt immediately and cleared away loose soil with his hands. His fingers touched wood. Old, smooth, strong cedar. His heartbeat quickened. Carefully, he dug around the edges until a large wooden chest emerged from the earth. It had been wrapped in layers of oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Even after years underground, the chest remained remarkably well preserved. Scout stood and wagged his tail, almost proudly. Elias smiled. "You found it." The old dog gave a soft bark. One bark, no louder, as though acknowledging a job finally completed. The chest was surprisingly heavy. Using every bit of his strength, Elias lifted it from the hole and carried it inside the old barn, where moonlight spilled through cracks in the wooden walls. The rusty iron lock had nearly fallen apart with age. One firm pull broke it free. Elias slowly lifted the lid. Inside lay his father's secrets. Not gold bars, not bags of silver, something far more valuable. Several carefully wrapped bundles of letters rested neatly on top. Beneath them sat a thick leather journal. There were rolled land maps tied with faded blue ribbon, a small iron key wrapped inside cloth, a leather pouch that jingled softly. When Elias opened it, several old gold coins gleamed in the moonlight. Enough money to help someone start over. But Samuel had never been a man who valued wealth above all else. There had to be more. Then Elias noticed a single envelope resting above everything else. His name appeared across the front, written in his father's familiar handwriting. "To my son, Elias." His hands trembled. For several moments, he simply stared. The handwriting brought tears to his eyes. He hadn't expected to see his father's words again. Slowly, he opened the envelope. Inside rested several folded pages. Samuel's handwriting filled every line. Elias took a deep breath and began reading aloud. "My dear son, if you are reading this letter, then Scout has done exactly what I prayed he would do. I never taught that old dog many tricks, but I trusted his heart more than most men's promises." Elias looked at Scout. The faithful dog sat quietly beside him, listening. As though he recognized every word, Elias continued, "You may wonder why I buried this chest instead of handing it to you directly. The answer is simple. Some truths are safest when they are discovered, not given." A chill ran through Elias. His father had planned this, years in advance. He turned the page. "Thomas is my son, and I love him. Never doubt that. But for many years, I watched him chase comfort instead of character. He believed wealth could solve every problem." Elias lowered his eyes. Those words hurt. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Samuel continued. "Several years ago, Thomas borrowed money without telling me. He believed he could double it through land speculation and gambling." Elias closed his eyes. He had suspected Thomas had wasted money before, but he had never imagined the truth reached this far. The letter continued. "When everything failed, creditors came to collect. If they had taken the ranch, generations of honest work would have disappeared." Samuel explained how he quietly sold personal possessions, paid the debts, and protected the ranch without humiliating Thomas before the town. He had chosen mercy over shame. But the experience taught him something painful. Thomas still believed wealth mattered more than wisdom. Elias turned another page. "I feared that if I simply divided everything equally, Thomas would eventually lose it all. Worse still, he might drag you down with him." Tears filled Elias's eyes. For years he had believed his father favored Thomas. Now he understood. Samuel had never stopped loving either son. He had simply carried a burden neither of them knew about. The next paragraph made Elias catch his breath. "There is another property, one I never spoke about publicly." Elias quickly unrolled one of the maps. His eyes widened. The drawing showed thousands of acres high in the mountains, clear streams, open grazing valleys, dense forests, natural springs, every boundary carefully marked. Attached to the map were official land records bearing the territorial seal. Samuel's journal explained everything. 25 years earlier, before purchasing the Walker Ranch, Samuel had quietly bought the mountain valley from a retiring trapper. The land had remained untouched ever since. Samuel called it Cedar Ridge Valley. He had intended it to become a refuge for future generations, a place no debt collector could ever seize. A place protected from greed. The journal contained years of careful notes, descriptions of fertile soil, water flowing year-round from underground springs, natural meadows perfect for cattle, timber harvested responsibly, wild apple trees already growing. Samuel had visited the valley every spring, sometimes alone, sometimes with Scout, never with Thomas, never with anyone else. Elias suddenly remembered. As a boy, he had often wondered why Scout disappeared with his father for several days every year. Now he knew. The old dog had walked those trails dozens of times. He hadn't forgotten a single one. One final note rested inside the journal. Samuel had written it only weeks before his death. "If Thomas has changed by now, help him. If he has not, protect what is here until wisdom reaches his heart. Never answer greed with hatred. Hatred only plants another crop of sorrow." Elias slowly lowered the letter. The barn became completely silent. He couldn't speak. Everything he had believed for the past 3 weeks had changed. His father had not rejected him. His father had trusted him with something far greater than cattle or buildings. He had trusted him with the future of the Walker family. Scout quietly stood. He walked toward Elias, then rested his gray muzzle against Elias's shoulder. Elias wrapped one arm around the faithful old dog. "You kept your promise." Scout closed his eyes. For 12 years, he had carried a memory no one else possessed. He had watched Samuel bury the chest. He had watched the soil covered again. He had returned to that place countless times after Samuel's death, waiting. Waiting until the right person followed him. Not because anyone had trained him to, but because loyalty had become part of who he was. Suddenly, Scout's ears stood upright. A low growl escaped his throat. Elias looked toward the barn entrance. Hoofbeats. Faint, growing louder. Lantern light flickered between the trees. Someone was coming. Elias quickly closed the chest. He covered it with an old horse blanket lying nearby. The voices drifted closer. Thomas, and the same two strangers. One of them laughed. If the old man hid something, we'll find it tonight. Elias tightened his grip on the journal. His father's final gift rested safely in his hands. But one thing had become painfully clear. The greatest challenge was no longer finding the secret. It was protecting it. As the lantern light crept across the barn doors, Scout silently positioned himself between Elias and the entrance. Old, grey, tired, yet still ready to guard the family he loved one last time. The lantern light grew brighter with every passing second. Elias crouched behind a stack of old hay bales inside the weathered barn, his father's journal pressed tightly against his chest. Beside him, Scout stood perfectly still, his ears raised, his eyes fixed on the large wooden doors. Outside, 3 horses stopped. Leather creaked. Boots struck the frozen ground. Thomas's voice broke the silence. "I don't care how late it gets. We're not leaving until we search every inch of this place." One of the strangers answered with quiet confidence. "If your father truly hid legal papers, they're worth more than a chest full of gold." The third man laughed. "Land is where fortunes are made." Elias felt his heart pound. He carefully lowered the journal into the cedar chest, closed the lid, and slid it farther beneath a pile of broken wagon wheels and old harnesses. Moonlight barely reached that corner of the barn. Scout looked back at him, almost asking, "Ready?" Elias nodded once. The heavy barn doors swung open. Lantern light spilled across the floor. Thomas entered first. He looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and the expensive coat he had worn only weeks before was now covered in dust. The 2 strangers followed. The taller man introduced himself weeks earlier as Victor Kane, a smooth-talking land investor from Denver. But Elias had asked around town. Victor wasn't an investor. He was a land speculator, a man who made his fortune buying desperate ranches for almost nothing. His partner, Silas Boone, carried a crowbar over one shoulder. Unlike Victor, Silas spoke very little. His cold eyes searched every shadow. Victor raised his lantern. "Your father built this barn himself." Thomas nodded impatiently. "So?" "So men like Samuel Walker didn't waste effort. If he hid something, it'll be somewhere built to last." Silas drove the crowbar beneath loose floorboards. Wood splintered. Dust filled the air. The sound echoed across the empty barn. Elias clenched his fists. He had spent years repairing those very boards beside his father. Now they were being destroyed in minutes. For nearly 2 hours, the 3 men searched. They opened grain bins, smashed old storage crates, pulled apart empty feed barrels. Silas even climbed into the hayloft, throwing decades of stored supplies onto the floor below. Still, nothing. Victor frowned. "He was smarter than I expected." Thomas slammed his boot against a wooden beam. "He had to leave something. My father always talked about protecting this family." Victor looked directly at Thomas. "Maybe he wasn't protecting you." The words struck harder than any fist. Thomas glared at him. "What do you mean?" Victor shrugged. "Maybe he didn't trust you." Silence filled the barn. Thomas said nothing. Deep inside, he feared Victor might be right. Hidden only yards away, Elias lowered his eyes. Hearing another man speak those words aloud hurt more than he expected. He had always hoped his brother would one day understand their father. Instead, Thomas seemed farther away than ever. Scout gently nudged Elias's hand. The old dog's calm presence reminded him of Samuel's final instruction. Never answer greed with hatred. Elias slowly relaxed. His father had prepared him for this very moment. Eventually, Victor sighed. "We're done here." Silas leaned his crowbar against the wall. "We've searched enough for one night." Thomas looked around the ruined barn. Broken boards, scattered tools, hay covering the floor. His father's carefully organized workshop now looked like a storm had torn through it. For just a brief moment, regret crossed his face. Then it disappeared. The three men mounted their horses and rode back toward the ranch house. Only after the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance did Elias emerge from hiding. He looked around the barn. His throat tightened. So much damage. Scout slowly walked through the mess. He sniffed broken tools, stopped beside Samuel's old workbench, then looked toward Elias. It was almost as if the old dog remembered how everything used to be. Elias picked up one of his father's hammers from the floor. Its wooden handle still carried faint marks where Samuel's rough hands had gripped it thousands of times. He quietly placed it back on the workbench. "One day," he whispered, "I'll make this right." Before sunrise, Elias carefully loaded the cedar chest into his wagon. He covered it beneath blankets and sacks of grain. Scout climbed beside it, as if guarding the treasure himself. They left the ranch unseen. By midday, they reached Silver Creek. Instead of returning to the cabin, Elias rode directly toward the county courthouse. The brick building stood proudly beside the town square. Its flag fluttered gently in the morning breeze. Inside, County Clerk Margaret Ellis greeted him warmly. "Elias, I'm sorry about your father." He removed his hat. "Thank you. I need your help." She noticed the large leather journal and rolled maps resting beneath his arm. "Let's see what you've brought." For nearly 3 hours, Margaret carefully examined every document. She compared signatures, checked land surveys, read official seals, pulled old record books from dusty shelves. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes widened. "Elias, these are genuine." He leaned forward. "They are?" She nodded. "Everyone." She unfolded the largest map across the desk. The drawing revealed an enormous mountain valley northwest of Silver Creek. More than 5,000 acres, natural rivers, dense forests, open grazing lands. Margaret shook her head in amazement. "I've worked in this courthouse 15 years. I had no idea Samuel Walker owned Cedar Ridge Valley." Elias smiled sadly. "Neither did I." She continued reading. "The ownership transferred entirely to you through this sealed declaration." Elias frowned. "But father never mentioned it." Margaret gently closed the journal. "He probably had his reasons." Within days, word spread across the territory. News traveled quickly wherever ranchers gathered. At the general store, the blacksmith shop, Sunday church, the barber. Every conversation seemed to end the same way. "Did you hear? Samuel Walker secretly owned Cedar Ridge Valley. They say it's bigger than the Walker Ranch. They say the springs never dry. They say the grass grows waist-high." Rumors grew larger with every telling. Some claimed the valley contained silver. Others insisted hidden gold mines rested beneath the hills. Few knew the truth. The greatest treasure wasn't buried metal. It was fertile land capable of feeding families for generations. Thomas heard the news 2 days later. He burst into Victor Kane's office in town. "It's impossible." Victor calmly folded a newspaper. "It appears your brother legally owns Cedar Ridge." Thomas slammed both hands onto the desk. "He tricked me." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Did he? Or did your father?" Thomas's face turned pale. For the first time since inheriting the Walker Ranch, doubt entered his heart. What if the will hadn't been a reward? What if it had been a test? Yet instead of reflecting, Thomas made another terrible decision. Determined to prove himself successful, He borrowed more money. Victor arranged the loans. The interest was crushing, but Thomas barely read the contracts. He believed the ranch would quickly repay everything. To raise cash, he sold 40 of Samuel's finest breeding cattle. Then another 60. He dismissed experienced ranch hands who had served the family for years. They cost too much, he declared. Without enough workers, fences fell into disrepair. Cattle wandered. Water troughs remained empty. The spring branding season became chaotic. Calves escaped through broken gates. Predators grew bolder. Losses mounted every week. Old Caleb Morris watched with sadness. "This ranch isn't failing because of drought," he quietly told another cowboy. "It's failing because no one is listening to the lessons Samuel spent 40 years teaching." Summer arrived. Then came disaster. A violent thunderstorm swept across the valley. Lightning struck the northern pasture. Fire spread through dry grass before rain finally extinguished it. Had the fences been properly maintained, the damage would have been limited. Instead, hundreds of frightened cattle stampeded through broken rails. By sunrise, nearly a third of the herd had vanished into the mountains. The financial loss was devastating. Thomas stood in the ruined pasture, staring silently at the broken fences. His expensive boots were covered in mud. His hands shook. Silas Boone rode beside him. "You still owe Victor." Thomas swallowed hard. "I'll pay." "How?" Thomas had no answer. That evening, Victor Kane arrived carrying several folded documents. He laid them across the dining table inside the ranch house. "If payment isn't made by the end of the month." He tapped the papers. "The Walker Ranch becomes mine." Thomas stared in disbelief. "You'd take my father's ranch?" Victor looked him directly in the eyes. "No, you signed it away yourself." Thomas's shoulders slumped. For the first time in his life, he understood what his father had spent years trying to teach him. A signature without wisdom can destroy generations of hard work. Across the mountains, life at Cedar Ridge Valley looked entirely different. Elias had begun building a small cabin near a clear spring. He hired local carpenters. He purchased supplies from struggling merchants in Silver Creek, helping their businesses grow. Former Walker ranch hands came asking for work. Elias welcomed every one of them, including old Caleb. "You sure you can afford us?" Caleb asked with a grin. Elias smiled. "My father always said, good people aren't an expense. They're an investment." The old foreman removed his hat. "Your father would be proud." Scout wandered happily through the open meadow, chasing butterflies like a much younger dog. Watching him, Elias couldn't help but think of Samuel. His father had not left him wealth simply to become rich. He had left him an opportunity to build something rooted in honesty, hard work, and kindness. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, a lone rider appeared on the trail leading into Cedar Ridge. The horse moved slowly. Its rider slumped in the saddle. As he drew closer, Elias recognized him immediately. Thomas. His clothes were dusty. His face was thinner. The confidence that had once filled his eyes was gone. He stopped a few yards away but did not dismount. For several long moments, neither brother spoke. Finally, Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I read Father's letter." He looked at Elias, his eyes heavy with regret. "I finally understand." And for the first time since Samuel Walker's funeral, the older brother began to cry. The evening sun dipped behind the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold, crimson, and deep purple. A cool breeze swept across Cedar Ridge Valley, bending the tall prairie grass like waves upon a quiet sea. Elias stood outside the half-finished ranch house, a hammer still resting in one hand. Around him, several ranch hands were putting away tools after another long day of building fences, repairing corrals, and raising the frame of a new barn. Scout lay peacefully beneath a cottonwood tree, his old eyes half closed, enjoying the warmth of the fading sunlight. Then he lifted his head. His ears twitched. He slowly stood. Everyone turned. A lone rider approached from the western trail. The horse walked with tired, uneven steps. Its rider leaned forward in exhaustion. As the figure drew closer, Elias recognized him. Thomas, the proud older brother who had ordered him off the family ranch only months earlier. Now, he barely looked like the same man. His expensive black coat was faded and torn. Mud covered his boots. His beard had grown untidy. Dark circles rested beneath tired eyes that no longer carried arrogance. Scout quietly walked toward the horse. Instead of barking, he gently sniffed Thomas's boot. Then, to everyone's surprise, the old dog slowly wagged his tail. Elias noticed. Even after everything that had happened, Scout welcomed Thomas. Perhaps dogs understood forgiveness better than people. Thomas climbed down from his horse with difficulty. For several moments, he simply stood there, unable to find the words. The ranch hands watched silently. Old Caleb Morris folded his arms. He remembered exactly how Thomas had treated Elias. Part of him wanted to send the man away. But Caleb also knew Elias. He suspected what would happen next. Thomas finally spoke. His voice cracked. I don't know why you would even let me come here. Elias quietly set down his hammer. You came. That's enough. Thomas looked down. I've lost everything. The words hung in the evening air. No one interrupted. After a long silence, Elias pointed toward the porch. Come inside. Thomas hesitated. You aren't angry? Elias looked at him calmly. I've had months to choose what kind of man I wanted to become. I decided I didn't want bitterness making those choices for me. Thomas lowered his eyes. The brothers entered the cabin. Scout followed close behind. Inside, the room smelled of fresh pine boards and strong coffee. The furniture was simple. A sturdy wooden table, 4 handmade chairs, a stone fireplace where a kettle gently steamed over glowing coals. Nothing fancy. Everything honest. Elias poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one across the table. Thomas accepted it with trembling hands. For several minutes, neither brother spoke. Only the crackling fire filled the silence. Finally, Thomas broke it. I read Father's letter. Elias nodded. I thought you might. Thomas stared into his coffee. I've read it 6 times. Every time, it hurts more. His voice became barely audible. I spent years believing Father loved you less. I thought he trusted me because I was the oldest. He swallowed hard. The truth was, I never gave him many reasons to trust me. Tears filled his eyes. I kept asking why he left me the ranch. I never asked why he left you the future. Elias listened without interrupting. His father had always taught him that sometimes people needed to empty their hearts before they could hear wisdom. Thomas took a deep breath. I need to tell you something. Elias nodded. I'm listening. Thomas rubbed his forehead. It started years ago. I thought I could make easy money. I borrowed against Father's cattle. I invested in land people said would become the next railroad town. He gave a bitter laugh. There never was a railroad. I lost everything. He continued quietly. When the debts came due, Father paid them. I never thanked him. I never even apologized. His shoulders shook. I just borrowed more. Caleb, who had quietly stepped onto the porch outside, lowered his head. He had suspected much of it. Hearing Thomas admit it aloud was different. Thomas looked toward the window. I thought inheriting the ranch would finally prove I wasn't a failure. Instead, I destroyed everything Father spent 40 years building. He reached into his coat. Carefully, he unfolded several papers and laid them on the table. Loan agreements, debt notices, legal claims. The final document carried Victor Kane's signature. Thomas pushed them toward Elias. I signed the ranch away. If I can't pay by next week, Victor owns it. Elias slowly examined the papers. His face remained calm. You trusted him. Thomas nodded. I believed every promise. He told me I'd recover. I wanted to believe him. Outside, the evening breeze rustled through the cottonwood leaves. Scout quietly rested beside Thomas's chair. The old dog leaned his head gently against Thomas's knee. Thomas looked down in surprise. "You still trust me?" Scout simply closed his eyes. Thomas scratched behind the dog's ears. Tears slipped down his face. "I don't deserve you." Elias smiled softly. "Father used to say dogs don't measure a man by yesterday. They watch what he does today." Thomas whispered, "I wish I'd listened to Father more." After another long silence, Elias stood and walked toward the fireplace. Above the mantel rested Samuel Walker's old Bible, the same Bible their mother had once read aloud every Sunday evening. Elias carefully opened it. A dried wildflower fell from between the pages. He smiled. "I remember this." Thomas looked up. "Mother picked that. The spring before she got sick." The brothers fell silent again. Elias turned several pages until he reached a passage their father often quoted. He read aloud, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God forgave you." He gently closed the Bible. Father believed those words. Thomas lowered his head. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "No," Elias answered honestly. "Neither do I." Thomas looked confused. Elias continued, "Forgiveness isn't earned. If it had to be earned, it wouldn't be forgiveness." The room became very still. Thomas covered his face with both hands. For the first time since childhood, he cried openly, not quiet tears, deep, painful sobs. Years of pride, years of guilt, years of pretending, all poured out at once. "I was jealous of you," he finally admitted. "I hated how Father smiled whenever he talked about your work. I thought he loved you more." Elias shook his head. "He smiled because he saw himself in me." Thomas looked confused. "And he loved you because he saw someone worth fighting for." The words settled deeply into Thomas's heart. He had never considered that possibility. When Thomas finally regained his composure, he stood. "I'll leave. I've already taken enough from you." He reached for the door. Before his hand touched the latch, Elias spoke. "Sit down." Thomas turned slowly. "I have something to ask." Thomas sat again. Elias looked directly into his brother's eyes. "The valley is large, bigger than one man can manage." Thomas frowned. "I don't understand. I need help." Thomas blinked. "You can't mean—" "I do. You want me to work here?" Elias nodded. "But not as an owner." "Not yet. As a ranch hand. You'll earn wages. You'll help build this place. You'll repay what you owe honestly." Thomas stared in disbelief. "You'd trust me after everything." Elias smiled gently. "I trust the man you're choosing to become." The room remained silent. Thomas looked around. The unfinished cabin, the simple furniture, the workers laughing outside after supper. Everything his younger brother had built looked peaceful, not because it was wealthy, because it was honest. Finally, Thomas slowly stood. He removed his expensive pocket watch, the last valuable thing he still owned. He placed it on the table. "I don't want charity. I'll earn every meal." Elias pushed the watch back toward him. "Then keep your father's gift. Tomorrow morning, you start before sunrise." Thomas almost laughed. "You sound exactly like Father." Elias smiled. "I learned from the best." The next morning, before dawn, Thomas awoke to the sound of a rooster crowing. He dressed quietly. For the first time in years, he put on simple work clothes instead of expensive town clothes. Outside, Caleb Morris waited beside the tool shed. The old foreman looked Thomas up and down. "You know how to swing a hammer?" Thomas smiled awkwardly. "I suppose I'm about to find out." Caleb handed him an axe. "Good. Today's lesson starts with chopping firewood." Thomas looked at the enormous pile of logs. "You couldn't have started smaller." Caleb grinned. "No." By midday, blisters covered Thomas's hands. His back ached. His shoulders burned. Several times he nearly quit. Each time, he remembered his father's words from the letter. Character grows where comfort ends. So he kept swinging. One log, then another, then another. Scout wandered over during the afternoon and lay nearby, watching quietly. Whenever Thomas paused, the old dog lifted his head, as if reminding him not to stop. Thomas laughed. "Even now you're keeping an eye on me." Scout's tail thumped against the grass. Weeks passed. Thomas repaired fences, mended wagons, learned to shoe horses. He apologized personally to every former ranch hand he had mistreated. Some accepted immediately. Others took longer. He never complained. He simply kept working. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Caleb watched Thomas helping a young ranch hand repair a broken gate. The old foreman smiled. Turning to Elias, he quietly said, "Your father was right." Elias looked at him. "About what?" Caleb glanced toward Thomas. He wasn't raising a ranch. He was raising two sons. It just took one of them a little longer to grow. As the brothers walked home together beneath the evening sky, Scout trotted happily between them. For the first time since Samuel Walker's death, the Walker family was walking the same road again. Not because the past had been forgotten, but because forgiveness had become stronger than pride. 3 years passed. The seasons came and went over Cedar Ridge Valley like pages turning in a well-loved book. Spring covered the meadows with wild flowers. Summer filled the fields with waist-high grass and healthy cattle. Autumn painted the cottonwoods gold. Winter wrapped the mountains in snow, yet smoke always rose from the chimneys of the growing ranch. What had once been an untouched valley hidden among the Rockies had become one of the finest ranches in the Colorado Territory. Not because it was the biggest, not because it made the most money, but because people knew something different about Cedar Ridge. Everyone was treated fairly. No traveler was turned away hungry. Widows received firewood before winter. Young men who wanted honest work always found it there. Families who had nearly lost hope found a second chance. And every person in the valley knew why. Because Samuel Walker's youngest son had chosen to build the future with kindness instead of revenge. The ranch had changed in remarkable ways. A large red barn now stood where only open grassland had once stretched. Strong cedar fences bordered hundreds of acres of pasture. Fresh water flowed through carefully built irrigation ditches, feeding gardens and orchards planted by the ranch hands and their families. Children laughed as they chased chickens across the yard. Women baked bread together in the outdoor ovens. The ringing of blacksmith hammers echoed through the valley each morning. What Samuel had once dreamed of had become something even greater. Not simply a ranch, a community. Elias had changed too. The quiet young ranch hand who had once doubted his father's love had become a respected leader. Yet little about him had truly changed. He still rose before sunrise. Still saddled horses himself. Still repaired fences whenever he found a broken rail. He insisted on eating meals beside his workers, rather than apart from them. Whenever someone thanked him for his generosity, he always answered the same way. "My father taught me that a ranch grows stronger when every family around it grows stronger." Those words spread throughout the territory. People began calling Cedar Ridge the ranch that opened its gates. Thomas had changed even more. No one would have recognized the man he had once been. The expensive coats were gone. The polished boots had been replaced by worn leather, stained with honest work. The soft hands that once avoided labor were now rough with calluses. He became the first man awake each morning, the last to leave the barn each evening. Whenever new ranch hands arrived, Thomas was the first to greet them. He never mentioned that he had once inherited the Walker Ranch. Instead, he introduced himself simply. "I'm Thomas. If you need help, ask." The pride that once ruled his heart had quietly disappeared. In its place grew humility and peace. One crisp autumn afternoon, the brothers rode together across the valley. The cattle grazed peacefully beneath a bright blue sky. Golden leaves drifted gently from the cottonwood trees. Scout trotted several yards ahead. His pace had slowed considerably over the years. The old dog no longer ran after every rabbit. He no longer chased calves through the pasture. His muzzle had turned almost completely white. Sometimes his back legs trembled after long walks. Yet every morning, without fail, Scout insisted on joining the brothers as they checked the herd. Thomas smiled. "I think he's still convinced we're the ones who need watching." Elias laughed. "Maybe we are." Scout stopped and looked back at them. His tail wagged slowly. Then he continued walking. Neither brother knew they were watching one of the faithful old dog's final rides. That evening, the ranch gathered for supper beneath the large dining shelter Elias had built beside the house. Long wooden tables filled with roasted venison, fresh bread, vegetables, beans, and apple pie stretched across the yard. Children laughed. Lanterns glowed warmly. Fiddlers played cheerful music, while couples danced beneath the stars. Caleb Morris stood and tapped his coffee cup with a spoon. The conversations quieted. "I've worked for the Walker family nearly 35 years. Everyone listened. I watched Samuel build his first fence. I watched Elias grow from a little boy into the man he is today." He looked toward Thomas. "And I've watched miracles happen." Thomas smiled awkwardly. Caleb continued. "The greatest miracle wasn't this ranch." He pointed toward the hundreds of happy people gathered together. "It was watching one family choose forgiveness when revenge would have been easier." The crowd applauded. Thomas quietly lowered his head. Even after 3 years, he still struggled to believe he had been given another chance. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Thomas found Elias sitting on the porch. The stars shone brightly overhead. Scout slept peacefully between their chairs. Thomas broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder what father would think if he saw this?" Elias smiled. "I think he already does." Thomas nodded slowly. "I spent so many years trying to earn his approval. And after he was gone, I finally learned I had already been loved." Elias looked at the mountains. "Sometimes we don't understand our parents until we become the people they hoped we'd be." Neither brother spoke again. They simply sat together beneath the stars. Scout sighed happily in his sleep. Winter came early that year. Snow covered Cedar Ridge in thick white blankets. The barns filled with hay. The cattle stayed close to sheltered valleys. Most mornings, Scout no longer joined the ranch hands outside. Instead, he rested beside the large stone fireplace. Children often curled beside him while their mothers cooked. The old dog accepted every gentle pat with quiet contentment. One afternoon, little Sarah, Caleb's granddaughter, asked Elias, "Why does Scout sleep so much now?" Elias knelt beside her. "Because faithful friends get tired too." She gently stroked Scout's head. "Will he always be here?" Elias paused, then smiled softly. "He'll always be part of this family." The little girl didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. Late one snowy evening, Scout quietly stood from his place beside the fire. Without making a sound, he walked toward the front door. Thomas noticed. "Where are you going, old fellow?" Scout looked back only once. Elias opened the door. The cold night air rushed inside. Scout stepped slowly into the snow. Instead of wandering toward the barns, he walked to the highest hill overlooking Cedar Ridge Valley, the same place where he often watched the sunrise. Elias and Thomas followed at a respectful distance. Scout reached the hilltop. He looked across the valley one last time. The lights from the ranch houses glowed warmly below. Smoke curled gently into the winter sky. Children's laughter drifted faintly through the evening air. The valley was peaceful, safe, exactly as Samuel had dreamed. Scout slowly lay down in the snow. Elias knelt beside him. He gently rested a hand on the old dog's gray head. "You've done well, old friend," Thomas whispered. "The best of us." Scout looked at both brothers. His tired tail moved once, twice. Then he closed his eyes. The old shepherd who had guarded one family's future for nearly 15 years quietly slipped away. No struggle, no fear, only peace. Snowflakes continued falling gently around them. Neither brother spoke. Words weren't enough. The entire valley attended Scout's burial. Children carried bundles of wild evergreen branches. The ranch hands built a simple cedar casket with their own hands. Caleb carved a wooden marker. The brothers chose a place beneath the largest oak tree overlooking the valley, the same hill where Scout had taken his final rest. Elias stood before the gathered crowd. His voice trembled. When people speak of great heroes, they usually tell stories about soldiers, or lawmen, or famous explorers. He looked toward the small grave, but some heroes never speak a single word. They simply stay faithful. He paused. If Scout had forgotten one place, if he had stopped trusting my father, if he had chosen comfort instead of loyalty, this valley wouldn't exist. Our family would have remained broken, and many of us standing here today would have never found this home. Thomas stepped forward. For a long moment he couldn't speak. Finally, he managed only a few simple words. I spent years chasing treasures. He looked at the wooden marker. The greatest treasure I ever found had 4 legs. Tears quietly flowed through the crowd. The years continued to pass. Children grew into adults. New families settled in Cedar Ridge. The ranch prospered beyond anything Samuel Walker could have imagined. One spring morning, Elias and Thomas stood beneath the old oak tree where Scout rested. Fresh wildflowers surrounded the simple grave. The wooden marker had weathered with age, but the words Caleb carved remained clear. Scout, faithful until the end. Thomas smiled. You know, I used to think Father buried his greatest treasure beneath that old barn. Elias shook his head. No. Thomas looked confused. Elias pointed toward the valley below. Families were working together in the fields. Children played beside the creek. Neighbors laughed as they repaired a wagon. Smoke rose peacefully from dozens of homes. Our father didn't hide land because he loved property. He hid it because he believed people could change. Thomas's eyes filled with tears, and he was right. Years later, travelers often stopped at Cedar Ridge and asked the same question. How did this ranch become so different from every other ranch in the territory? Some expected stories about hidden gold. Others hoped to hear tales of silver mines or secret fortunes. Instead, Elias always led them to the old oak tree. He would rest one hand upon the weathered marker and smile. It all started with a faithful dog who never forgot a promise. Then he would tell them about Samuel Walker, about 2 brothers who nearly lost each other, about pride that destroyed, about forgiveness that rebuilt, about a simple letter buried beneath an old barn, and about a loyal dog named Scout who guarded not merely a chest, but a family's chance to become whole again. As the years turned into generations, the story spread across the Colorado Territory. Parents told it to their children around warm fireplaces. Grandparents repeated it on quiet winter evenings. Young ranchers remembered it whenever greed tempted them to take shortcuts. The lesson endured long after every building had aged and every fence had been replaced. People eventually forgot how many cattle the Walkers owned. They forgot how many acres stretched across Cedar Ridge. They even forgot how much the land was worth. But they never forgot the truth Samuel Walker had quietly taught through the life of one faithful dog. That the richest inheritance a person can leave behind is not measured in land, cattle, or gold. It is measured in character, in forgiveness, in faithfulness, and in the courage to trust that love is stronger than pride. The end. Moral lesson. The greatest treasures in life are rarely the ones buried beneath the ground. They are the values we protect, the people we forgive, and the promises we keep. Wealth may build a ranch, but only love, humility, and unwavering faithfulness can build a legacy that lasts for generations.